Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I will just note, you'll notice a few extra photographers around. They're making a film about Tony Foster, so just ignore them or smile when they're directing a camera towards you. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Fairman, Chief Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Center. I've had the great pleasure of working with Tony Foster and with Duncan Robinson, former director of the Yale Center for British Art, on this exhibition of a selection of Tony Foster's work, now on display upstairs on the second floor. In fact, we are very happy to welcome Tony back to the center. It was exactly 34 years ago, almost to the day, that we hosted his first ever exhibition in the United States, curated by Duncan when he was director here. Tony lives in Cornwall, in southwestern England, with his wife Anne, also an artist. As he has said, despite that county's beautiful landscape, benign climate, and relaxed ambience, all conducive to the making of art, he admits to the irony that he often travels elsewhere, deliberately seeking places where few people and even fewer artists have ever set foot. In 1984, Tony traveled on foot and by canoe from Maine to Massachusetts, inspired by Henry David Thoreau's words recorded in his book, On Walden Pond. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life. The record of Tony's journey resulted in the exhibition Thoreau's Country, a visual diary, which opened at the Yale Center for British Art in May 1985. Several works in that display were acquired by Rachel Lambert Mellon, Paul Mellon's wife, and are now part of the collections of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, a library and research institute that was established after her death. 2 watercolors depicting Walden Pond and a barn nearby in Concord have been loaned back to us for our exhibition. In 1986, after his New England experience, Tony set out to hike 215 miles of the John Muir Trail from Yosemite to Lone Pine, California, which he undertook, as he says, as an homage to the patron saint of American national parks. In 1988, he made the first of his painting expeditions to the Grand Canyon, and 10 years later, he retraced the steps of 19th century explorers Lewis and Clark between the Musselshell and Snake Rivers in Montana and Idaho. Tony's paintings are visual records made on the spot, paintings done sometimes in the midst of pretty dreadful weather conditions, as I think he'll tell you today, like the occasional howling blizzard or drenching rainfall, but always from a carefully selected point of view. If I may quote Duncan Robinson here, for Tony Foster, each work is a page in a visual diary, a richly pictorial chronicle of events and encounters along the way, which constitutes both journey and destination. I have visited Tony in his studio in Cornwall, and he has loaned some wonderful things from his own cabinet of curiosities picked up on his journeys. Each spoonful of dirt carefully brushed off the soles of his boots, or a twig, a pebble, a discarded feather, even a tiny bottled sample of melted snow, is placed in a carefully labeled packet and pinned to a large board on one wall. Some of these souvenirs, or maybe they should be called talismans, they're certainly an inspiration for him. They appear within the frames of his paintings, as you will be able to see in the exhibition and in the slides today. Tony also records the day's events in tiny red memorandum books in his tent every evening, and we have a couple of those in the display upstairs as well. The written accounts of his encounters with nature are just as carefully rendered as his paintings. Today, Tony will explain his process to us, how he prepares for his journeys, from planning logistics with friends and colleagues and local inhabitants, packing his tent, his brushes, a tiny paint box, also in a case upstairs. I hope he has another one. And his homemade lightweight easel, to saying goodbye to his, may I say, long-suffering wife, Anne. He has visited and painted a wide range of breathtaking landscapes around the world, from Death Valley, America's lowest, hottest, and driest national park, to Mount Everest, Earth's highest mountain above sea level. He is an artist who depicts nature, but is at heart a conservationist. For as he says, no one can spend long periods of time in these places without becoming concerned for their protection. Elected a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in 1994, Foster received a special medal from them in 2001 for his artistic portrayal of the world's wilderness. This intrepid artist explorer has traveled much of the world, always in search of its unspoiled natural beauty, recording his experiences, sharing the delight of his discoveries, and arguing for the protection of these fragile places. I'd like to welcome Tony to the podium to talk about his work. And afterwards, I think we'll have time for a few questions, so think about that as you listen to him. And then join us for a reception in the library court, which I hope you'll join us for, and have a chance to talk to Tony a little further, and then look more at his work on the second floor. Tony.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's a good start. My braces have just popped. Despite what Elizabeth said, you will have noticed there are cameramen around and people making films. I would like you to ignore them if you can, but I'd also like you to laugh heartily at any jokes, not hysterically, but heartily, and if the camera happens to focus on you, look as if you're enjoying yourself. I assume that most of the people in the audience here don't know much about my work, and so I thought I would start by describing something about my process, and then I'll show about 40 slides of various places where I've worked, and that whole event should take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions. So if you keep the questions till the end, that would be helpful. But if, on the other hand, I blank on some place name or some fact that I'm trying to retrieve from my brain, and you happen to know it, then perhaps you just shout it out, okay? Because that might be helpful. Thank you. So I should say that really what I do can be summed up in one sentence. I make watercolor diaries of journeys in wildernesses. So if we break that sentence down, they're watercolors because watercolor is the most portable medium. The places where I work are remote, difficult to get to, and also the paintings I do are often quite large. And so the idea that you could use, for instance, oil paints, is just completely impossible. They'd be too heavy to carry, they would never dry, they get insects stuck all over them. It would just be an impossibility. So watercolor is obviously the way to go. And when I say it's very portable, this box here, or at least the one in the case upstairs, which is my original box, which I've been using for 30 odd years now, is the only box I ever use. Even in my studio, it's the only box I ever use. And inside it are about 20 tiny packs of color. This is called the Bijou, the Winsor & Newton Bijou No. 2. Because Elizabeth confiscated my original box, I hunt around. I realized they no longer make this tin box, which I love very much. It's got a little thing, you stick your thumb through it, and you open it up, and you can use it. And it's almost invisible and very lightweight, most important. But anyway, I hunted around, and I was hunting through my wife's drawers in her studio, and I found a brand new box which she'd never used, and I immediately stole it. So this is the one I'm going to be using for the next few weeks while the exhibition continues. So it's very portable, and of course it dries quickly, unless you're in a rainforest, in which case, of course, it never dries at all, but it dries quickly, generally speaking, and there are all the colors I need in there. There are, with 20-odd colors, there are probably millions and millions of combinations. It always makes me laugh when I see novice painters with a watercolor box the size of a piano keyboard, and they see me doing some enormous painting, and they can't believe that I do it with this little box. But anyway, I do. It seems like a magic trick to me too sometimes. So they're watercolors because it's portable. They're diaries because the work is not simply about seeing a particularly choice piece of landscape and putting a frame around it, metaphorically putting a frame around it and copying it. They're about trying to explain to people who don't have the good fortune that I have to go to these places, trying to explain what it's actually like to be there, what it's like to travel to that place, what it's like to spend time in it, and what it's like to work in it, who you meet, what animals you encounter, things, all the disasters that happen, all the good things that happen on any journey in remote places. And so they incorporate diaries, notes, talismans, souvenirs, maps, all sorts of things which explain more to you than simply what the place looks like. I'm trying to explain simply as I can what it's like to live there for a while, even if it's a short while, a few weeks or months. So they're watercolor diaries of journeys. The journey aspect of this obviously is pretty important. Because they're in wild places, the journey, generally speaking, is not done in a truck or even in a helicopter, although occasionally I have been helicoptered into places. But generally speaking, the journey is done either on foot or by canoe or kayak or raft, because those are the only ways really to get into places which are untouched by human beings, or virtually untouched by human beings. If there was a road through it, then it's not a wilderness. If there's a telegraph pole, it's not a wilderness. If there's a gas station, there certainly isn't a wilderness. And so if I find those places, I just keep on going until I get to places where they no longer exist. So they're about the idea that we should celebrate the fact that even in our seemingly overcrowded world, there are these extraordinarily beautiful places which exist without any interference whatsoever, as far as one can tell. So that's a basic description of the process. I should say that when I get into these places, of course, I have to then put up a tent and live in a tent. I have a tadpole tent which stands about this high off the ground, and it weighs 3.5 pounds. It's a tiny North Face tadpole. I claim to be still using the same one that I started with, but 30 odd years ago. But in fact, North Face had a policy or a guarantee that said, if your tent is worn out or broken for any reason, they will replace whichever part of it is worn out or broken. So mine's had 3 sets of poles, 2 floors, 3 fly sheets, 2 inners, and multiple other bits and pieces, which North Face every time have replaced for me. So it's like the chopping block in the Tower of London, where they say, or the axe, I should say, the executioner's axe in the Tower of London, where they say it's the original axe, but it's had 3 new heads and 5 new handles. My tent is the same thing. So I live in this tent. I worked out, in fact, that having been doing this kind of work for 35 years, I must have lived in that tent for between 7 and 8 years. Now, if on your job description it said, when you apply as a young person, you've got to live in a tadpole tent for 8 years, you wouldn't even consider such a thing. But because I've done it step by step, it doesn't seem quite as onerous as it would otherwise if you were to start with that idea that that's how long you were going to have to spend in the darn thing. But I've got to say that if anybody ever suggests we go on a camping holiday, I don't consider camping to be a holiday. Camping is darn hard work as far as I'm concerned. I should also say that if I can help it, I don't travel alone. I'm very, very fortunate in that I've got a whole group of traveling companions who are perfectly happy to come on a creative adventure with me, to spend time with me, to help me get to where I want to go to, sometimes to do the cooking, certainly very often to help carry the stuff into these places, and to look after me, help with all the logistics, help with the planning sometimes, and so on. And I have a full address book which I thumb through, and I think, I wonder who'd like to go to the rainforest. And I go through and I think, oh, I know. And I phone somebody up and say, hey, you don't fancy a few weeks in the rainforest, do you? And they, oh, okay, well, let's think about it. And generally speaking, I can manage to get somebody to come with me. Sometimes a whole group of people, up to a dozen sometimes. Sometimes it's just one other person. And sometimes it's nobody at all. There are places that people just don't want to go, especially if they've been once already. The rainforest is particularly unpopular most of the time. Everybody likes to go on a cruise up the Amazon in a nice boat, but very few people actually want to camp in the place and suffer the constant rainfall and constant being bitten by insects and constant being covered in mud and constantly having your belly button go mouldy unless you put athlete's foot powder in it, and so on. There are so many problems with living in a rainforest that I find it hard to recruit people to do that. But generally speaking, in mountains, deserts, canyons, I can find people willing to come. And so without them, I must say that much of my work could not be done at all. I should also say that I don't use photographs. The work is resolved on site. If it's a 7-foot painting, which is the biggest I've ever done, by the way, 7 feet by 4 was the biggest I've ever done. But if it's a big painting like that, it is still done on site. And the idea of doing large-scale watercolors on site is such an outrageous idea that I think, in a way, it's the reason that I do have something of a reputation amongst a small group of people, because I don't think that anybody else is doing it. Of course, not all the work's large-scale, but and a large-scale painting might well take 2 weeks or 3 weeks actually just working on that one painting until it's big enough, or finished enough, I should say, resolved enough to roll it up into its aluminium tube where it's protected and put the stopper on it and then move on to painting something else. And I travel along like that for weeks or months at a time and then come home to my studio in Cornwall, greet my wife, finish my paintings in my studio and go to the pub across the road. So that's basically the story of my life. I should also say that I work on themes. And so Elizabeth has mentioned a couple of the themes. There was one about Henry Thoreau. That was the first one I ever did in the United States. Then after that followed a theme about John Muir. So I hiked the John Muir Trail, 215 miles, and did a whole series of paintings along there. And that exhibition opened at the Academy of Sciences in San Francisco and then went to the Smithsonian. And so the themes I work on, there might be a theme about deserts. I did a theme called Arid Lands, which was all about deserts. I did one about rainforests. I did one about water. I did one about volcanoes and so on. So I work on a theme, and a theme might take 3 or 4 years to complete. Sometimes it's a small theme, like the Lewis and Clark theme only took, I think, a year, maybe. But anyway, somebody has told me that I've done 17 themes. So I guess some of them are much shorter and some of them are much longer. But 2 or 3 years is the average, I think. And the theme I want to talk about today, or show you today, it's my latest major series, and it's called Exploring Beauty. And my idea behind it was that beauty is a subject which is absolutely evaporated from contemporary art. The idea that you might produce something beautiful is sort of anathema to many contemporary art curators, and I've often wondered why that should be. It seems like, you know, it's like romance. It's not a subject we can actually talk about. And I thought, well, that was a shame, because a lot of the places I work in are exceptionally beautiful, and I realized that a lot of my work actually ends up beautiful. That's not necessarily the intention, but it does. And what triggered it, in a way, was a conversation I had about 38 years ago with Ronald Feldman in New York. Ronald Feldman used to run, I don't know if he still does, I suspect he does, run a very influential contemporary art gallery in New York. And I went to see him as a young artist to see if he would be interested in taking me on into his stable of artists. And he was quite interested. He said, well, look, if you give me some work, I'm going to the Cape this weekend, I'll take it home with me, and I'll just think about it. So I gave him a batch of work, and he took it to the Cape and came back, and I met him on the Tuesday. And he said, look, I've really enjoyed having your work in my house in Cape Cod, in the Cape. And he said, but I'm sorry, I can't represent you. Your work is just too beautiful. And I thought at the time, well, that's a shame that the fact that you're producing beautiful things means that you can't actually be represented. And so I suppose that idea has been boiling away now for the last 35 years, and I thought it was time that I actually did something about it. So my approach was to ask, I thought, well, I can't be the arbiter as to what's beautiful and what isn't. And so I thought I would ask a whole group of people who I came to call my luminaries, people who spend a lot of time in wild places, explorers, geologists, biologists, botanists, volcanologists, mountaineers, climbers, people who spend a lot of time in wild places. I would ask them David Attenborough, for example, I would ask them to nominate the most beautiful wild place they'd ever seen. And I would then go and see if I could find what it was that they had thought so beautiful and make a painting about it. So they were all to write an essay or a piece about why they thought this place was beautiful, and that would be put in the catalogue. Anyhow, all of them took the task very seriously, and the exhibition that resulted is now on exhibition in the Foster Art and Wilderness Foundation in California. So I think it's time now we started looking at it. So this is basically Foster on the move. Those of you who have been backpacking will know that I haven't got much in that backpack. And then the reason for that is that I've already pitched my tent, I've already laid the sleeping bag inside it, I've already put my stove out, I've already sorted out my food and hung it up a tree. And so, in fact, I'm just off to find a painting site now. But you see on my backpack there, you see my folding drawing board, my aluminium tube with the watercolor paper inside it, and I'm just off now to search for a site. And this is the board laid out and in operation. This is me painting the north face of Everest. My great friend and Sirdar, who's the man in charge of the Sherpas and the porters, Ang Puri, who would never leave my side. He was always there looking after me. And you see the drawing board folded out to 4'6". Each section is 18 inches, folded out to 4'6" by 3 feet, that one, I think. Yes, 4'6" by 3 feet. I do have bigger boards, I have smaller boards and so on, depending on what I'm going to paint. Propped up with my hiking poles, and then with guy lines holding it in place with rocks and so on to hold it in place in high winds. And me sitting there just at the North Face base camp, more or less, frozen half to death, but working on a big painting of Everest. And the painting I was working on is actually on display in the exhibition upstairs. This is actually the east face of Everest. The paint that I was just working at the north face, but this is the east face. I'm the only person, I believe, in the world who's ever painted all 3 faces of Everest. Everest is basically triangular. And so you have the southwest face in Nepal, and the north face and the east face in Tibet. And I've been up to Everest to paint 3 times. And you'll see here, this is the east face of Everest. The luminary for this was Britain's foremost climber, someone called Steve Venables, who summited the east face from the east face. In the end, it was a party of 4, but 3 of them dropped out, left him to summit on his own. He summited too late in the day, came down 500 feet, cut himself a snow seat, sat in it all night. This is without oxygen, sat in it all night, and then found his way back down to the East Face base camp. And when asked if he'd suffered any permanent damage from having done that, he said, well, nothing serious. I just lost 2 or 3 toes and a couple of fingers, but nothing serious. But anyhow, he nominated the east face of Everest as the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. So I was then duty-bound to go and paint it. And a very difficult place to get to. I never saw this entire picture in one go. I only saw it in bits because the weather was so atrocious that sometimes you'd see the left-hand side but not the right-hand side, and vice versa. Sometimes you'd see nothing in the valley at all. Sometimes you wouldn't see Everest for ages. And I was very worried that I'd actually got everything in the wrong place. I wasn't sure that I got things in the right place. And so when Steve Venables came to the opening of the exhibition in London, he stood in front of the painting for ages, and I was very concerned because I thought he was figuring out where I'd got it wrong. And so I went over and said, well, Steve, what do you think? And he said, Tony, I know exactly where you're sitting. He said, it brings it all back to me. And so I thought, wow, thank goodness for that. That's a relief. And this is a little painting, only 16 inches by 12 or something like that. And we were stuck in our tents for 3 days in a blizzard while I was painting the east face. And I was so bored. I'd read my book, I'd read everybody else's books. And so I just opened the tent flap and painted a kind of nondescript rock face that I could see outside. And so that's the painting that I managed to get just looking out of my tent flap. This is when we came down from the east face. You can see it's a massive party of people, most of whom are Sherpas and yak drivers and porters. And we're all of us throwing our hats in the air because we're relieved that none of the yaks have died, nobody has died, nobody broke a leg. We all emerged relatively unscathed from the east face. And so everybody's relieved and happy at that. Here I am working underwater. David Attenborough, when I asked him what the most beautiful place in the world he'd ever seen was, he said it was the tropical coral reefs. And he thought he was safe nominating that because it's a sort of general thing. He knew that if he nominated a specific place, it would immediately be trashed by people going there. And so he thought if he nominated something general like tropical reefs, then that would be a safe thing to do. And so I devised a way of working underwater. I've been a scuba diver since I was in my 20s. And I worked out a way of drawing onto architect's drafting film, which is a kind of plastic drafting film, on a plastic drawing board, and using Caran d'Ache crayons, those water-soluble, slightly water-soluble crayons, to get the colours and so on. And I found that you could put on an extra weight belt, sink to the bottom, and then sit quietly and draw the fish and so on. At first, of course, the fish are curious and they come up to you and to see what you're doing. But then they just, after a little while, they just get on with their lives, and you can sit and draw them perfectly happily, and it's actually very peaceful. And so having drawn it doesn't really show it here, but this is the painting that I did from my drawings. So I do a series of drawings, and then I do a sort of composite painting of what I found in 2 or 3 dives, probably. And this is actually from Little Cayman. Little Cayman, that's a grouper, a great big grouper. In Little Cayman, the groupers assemble there to breed. And that grouper there was about, I don't know, it must have been 4'6", I suppose. And it kept coming up and nudging me. And I never figured out whether it was trying to breed with me or trying to get me to move away from its spot. But anyway, I stayed there, and it stayed there with me for a very long time. This is now in the Maldives. I thought, as a luminary, I better ask my wife Anne what she thought the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen was. And she said, I was delighted when she said it. She said, well, the sunsets in the Maldives are the most lovely things I've ever seen. So blow me, we had to go back to the Maldives so I could paint some. So I painted a set of 6 Maldives sunsets. And it's a wonderful thing to do because, of course, you actually only get 20 minutes. It starts at 6:10 and it finishes at 6:30. And so you can have a gin and tonic before you start. You sit and do the painting, and then you have another gin and tonic and go for your supper. And that seemed to me to be an excellent way to work. So, but talking about beauty, I found that one thing that's completely anathema to most people involved in contemporary art is the idea of a sunset. Anybody who could paint a sunset, that's such a cliche that it shouldn't be allowed. It ought to be banned by law, really. But anyway, and here I'm in Greenland. Greenland was suggested to me by, sorry, it's gone. Anyway, a young woman who was who was taken up to live in northern Greenland by her father, Wally Herbert, Sir Wally Herbert, who was the first man to cross the Arctic solo, I think, across the ice. And he took his wife and daughter to live up in northern Greenland with the Inuit. And she comes and goes from Greenland a great deal, and she still has many Inuit friends, so she lives in Cornwall, actually not far from us now, with her husband and baby. Anyway, she suggested northern Greenland, and that's what I'm painting there. And that's the painting I was doing. I think it's about 5 feet long, And it's basically a painting of icebergs. And all the objects along the bottom there, what happened was this iceberg here, these icebergs are huge. They can be a quarter of a mile by half a mile by 400 or 500 feet high. And of course, the bulk of the iceberg is actually underwater, so you don't know how big it is. But this one here, this one turned over. And when it turned over, it created an enormous tidal wave that came ashore and washed away lots of boulders and soil and scrub. And it was just below where we were camping. So we went down to see what it had revealed. And sure enough, it had revealed the remains of an Inuit settlement. Very ancient, I think, because there were stone tools. Well, there were some metal tools there, bits of metal, there were arrowheads and things. There were some Venetian glass beads. What were they doing in northern Greenland? Lots of little glass beads. There was a piece of glass. There was seal's teeth, seal bones, and some stone tools as well. And so we collected all these things together, and even, can you believe it, a piece of at least 18th century Chinese porcelain from a tea bowl, a Chinese tea bowl. What the heck is that doing in northern Greenland? Good question. I don't know the answer. And so I painted all these things, and then I presented everything to the local school teacher and said, "This is your history. You must keep this." And I hope he did. We don't know. Now we're on our way to Machapuchire. Machapuchire is a mountain to one side of Annapurna. And if you were to take a vote amongst mountaineers on the most beautiful mountain in the world, Machapuchire would come out top. Partly because it's very, very satisfactory and it's pointed, beautifully pointed and interesting to look at, but also because it's never actually been climbed, because it is thought of as a holy mountain by the Hindus and by the Buddhists. Funnily enough, the lower slopes are thought of as holy by the Buddhists, and the summit is thought of as holy by the Hindus. So nobody has ever climbed it. People have climbed to within 50 feet of the summit, but nobody's ever summited. And so this painting is one of three, I think, done as a sort of diary on my way to Machapuchire. And this is my cook, Ram. Ram has been with me on all my Himalayan expeditions, and he's the most inventive cook you could ever come across. He can make I wouldn't say it's haute cuisine, but I would say that it's always edible, which is pretty good considering the conditions he works under. And this is one of the porters, whose name I can't quite remember. But anyway, they set this site up for me because it was raining and so on, and they set it all up. And it's interesting that I find that when I'm working with people locally, my success at making a painting is as important to them as it is to me. They get very involved in the work, and they love to be part of it. The other thing is, of course, the nice thing is that the porters, generally speaking, will work every day, and the Sherpas, everybody works every day. They walk every day, they hike, they carry heavy loads every day. But with me, we'll be traveling along, we'll be hiking along, and I'll see something I want to paint, and I'll say, "Stop, we've got to make camp now. I want to paint this. I'm going to do a big painting. It might take 6 days." And they know that if it's going to take 6 days, they can go off and see their girlfriends, they can see their friends, they can stay with their uncle, they can do whatever they like, provided they're back in place in time for me to move on when I'm ready. And so they're being paid for that. It's like paid holiday for them. So I always have a very willing and happy group of porters and Sherpas, because they always like to come on my trips because they're not nearly as punishing as having to carry stuff through the ice field on Everest. And that's the painting I was doing as I was sitting under the umbrella. This is Machapuchire here at the top. As you can see, a beautifully pointed mountain. And this is the path to it here, going through sort of scrub at about, I guess, 13,000 feet. And the path actually goes over these ridges and down and over and down and over and down. And it keeps on doing that in the most exhausting way until you finally arrive on the slopes of But this is the terrain you're going through. As you can imagine, it's not really straightforward. It's pretty punishing in many places. Now that's the painting that I finally did of that series of 3. And that is Machu Picchu seen from Annapurna Base Camp. So that's a good view of it from the snowfield on Annapurna. And that's what they call a tea house, where we stayed for the night. A pretty bleak place to stay, but still preferable to putting a tent up. Because when you put a tent up in these cold places, of course, you've got a good quality sleeping bag and all those other things, but it's still pretty cold. You take your clothes off, you get in your sleeping bag. The last thing you want to do is get out again. And the Sherpas, bless them, always get up about dawn. They make the tea, and then they come and rattle on your tent, say, "Tony, bed tea, bed tea." And then they unzip the tent, and you sit up in your sleeping bag with no clothes on, and all the ice all your breath that's turned into icicles above your head, then it is rattled off and goes down the back of your neck, and it certainly wakes you up pretty fast. So that's a preferable place to stay if you can find it. And that's the view from my bedroom window, completely covered in snow. And this is on the way back down from Annapurna Base Camp, and that's Ram there, I think, and I'm not sure who that is. Anyway, it's my party. My party was about, I think there were probably a party of 10, maybe, of whom 6 were porters and Sherpas, and 4 were 3 American friends and me. Oh, and this is back in Kathmandu. I don't know if you noticed, but on the paintings, the big painting of Machu Picchu, there were all sorts of vials of colour along the bottom. And I got those from this cheery man here in Kathmandu, who sells this colour for the Hindu colour festivals, where when you, on a particular day when everybody gets together and they all throw colour into the air, this powdered colour, and everybody ends up in sort of rainbow-coloured hue. It's the most exotic and beautiful thing to see. And so I got all this colour from him to incorporate into the painting. All the colours have a specific symbolic reason. So I can't tell you what they all are at the moment, but they're all labelled on the painting, actually. But anyway, they all have a certain symbolism. So the colours you choose to throw denote something. Oh, now we're in Chile. Chile was suggested by 2 people. One, Professor Ruiz, who is Chile's most well-known, what are they called? People who look at stars. Help me out, please. Sorry? Celebrities? Anyway, whatever. We've all got it except me. And so she suggested the Atacama Desert was the most marvelous place because, of course, the sky is the clearest you'll ever be. You're very, very high, up at about 12,000 feet most of the time. And so it's marvelous for seeing the stars. And another person who suggested it was a volcanologist friend, a fellow called Professor Stephen Sparks, who is probably one of the foremost volcanologists. And he suggested the world's most beautiful volcano was Parinacota, which is, you have to go through the Atacama Desert to go to it, and it's up in the Andes. And so I killed 2 birds with one stone there, and here I am on my way to Parinacota. And that's a little painting, only about 10 inches square, I think. Actually, it's rather good that I can blow them up to this size and they still hold together. I thought that being at this size, they would sort of fall apart, but they don't seem to. They seem to hold together quite nicely. And here we are along the coast of Chile. As you know, Chile is a very narrow country. And we were up in the Andes, and it was absolutely bitter. And I was with 3 friends, and I could see that they weren't enjoying themselves. I had told them that they wouldn't enjoy themselves, but I don't think they believed me. And so they were getting very grumpy. And I said, look, we've got to go north. We can either go north along the spine of the Andes, along the Atacama, or we can go down to the coast go along the coast, and then cut back inland, go up to the Andes. I can paint Parinacota, and then we'll come back along the Andes and through the Atacama, because who knows, within a couple of weeks it might have warmed up a bit. So they gladly agreed to that, and so we went along the coast as part of the journey. And here this was we were very fortunate to be invited to go to the observatory up in the Andes, and we went right up to 15,000 feet, I think, where there is a research station up there with these enormous dishes, huge, absolutely monstrous. They had to invent vehicles to carry these things from the port up to 15,000 feet. They invented these things, and they had 16 wheels, each of them probably about 10 feet. I would think I was about in the middle axle, so I guess about 10 feet. Each of them steered independently, and somehow or other they got these gigantic dishes up to 15,000 feet, and they're all of them computer controlled, and they can put them out to 1.5 miles in several directions to make a huge array, and they can be within 1.5 millimeters of accuracy from each other, which seems, what I thought was so wonderful was that this was all about human curiosity. It wasn't about the military, there was no commercial gain to be had as far as anybody could see. It was simply because people were curious, and I thought that was a marvelous thing. And so we came down from the 15,000 foot place, and as dusk was falling, and I must confess this is the only painting I've ever done from a photograph, because it was bitterly cold. My friends wanted to get down to somewhere a bit warmer. I wanted to get down to somewhere warmer too, and so I took that photograph, and I did that work from photograph. So here's me at work in the Atacama Desert, doing. I was sitting on a spine, really, which is a bit, and it looked a bit like a stegosaurus backbone. It was a sort of undulating spine like this, which went up and up and up, and gave me a good view of the landscape. And you can see how exquisite it is. This spine here, which I walked along, goes on and on and on, and finally gets you down to the desert floor. And there's a salt pan here, and then but look at these exquisite range of colours just in this desert. This volcano here is interesting to me because it's called Le Concabur. And when I was working in Bolivia a few years before, I had failed to climb Le Concabur. I'd passed out at 18,500 feet, and Le Concabur is 19.5. And so I'd passed out, and then I'd had to stumble my way back down again. And so to me, that looked like unfinished business, but it remains unfinished business because I've never climbed it. But anyway, that did teach me something, which was that probably my altitude ceiling, everybody has one, an altitude ceiling. It's just that you don't know what it is until you go and test it. And the only way to test it is to climb up and find out. And I have found that when I've got above 18,500 feet, that I do begin to get pretty, it gets pretty marginal. So I think that's probably my altitude ceiling. Anyhow, I thought that was a nice painting. But the volcano that I was going to go and paint was Parinacota. And so when I asked Steve Sparks, Steve, what's the most beautiful volcano in the world? And he said Parinacota. I said, oh, Steve, can you suggest another one? Because I've already painted that one. And he said, oh, well, which side did you do it from? And I said, well, from the Bolivian side. And he said, oh, no, I'm talking about the Chilean side. So I had to go all the way back in order to paint from the Chilean side. So this painting was done in 1997, and this is the Bolivian side of Parinacota, which makes an interesting contrast in the exhibition. Because here I am painting the Chilean side, and of course what's so beautiful about the Chilean side is this lake here, where when it's calm and the sun's out, there's an absolutely perfect reflection of Parinacota in the lake. This lake is up at about 15,500 feet, full of flamingos and waterfowl of all sorts. A very beautiful place, but bitterly, bitterly cold at night, and baking hot during the day. So it's a real place of contrasts. And although I worked there, I think, for 5 days, all my friends had camped about 2,000 feet below me, and they would come up every day, make sure I was still alive, bring me some food and some water, and then go away again. And when I finally packed up and they came to fetch me, I couldn't have been more relieved, I must say. I was fed up with being frozen and baked. That's the painting I was doing. It looks brighter than the photograph, but in fact, these foreground rocks were really that beautiful ochre colour in bright sunlight. And Parinacota is certainly a more delicious-looking volcano from this side than from the Bolivian side. Oh, here we are on Mont Blanc. French TV company asked me if I would go and paint. They were doing a series or a program called Artistes d'en haut, Artists on High, and so they asked me if I would go and paint Mont Blanc, and so I readily agreed. I teamed up with Chamonix's senior guide. To be a Chamonix guide is a great, great honour. You have to be extraordinarily good, and he too was a painter. His father had been a painter and senior Chamonix guide too, so it was a real family tradition. And he was the most interesting man, called Lionel Vibo. And Lionel and I spent many happy days up in Mont Blanc, painting together, and really got on extremely well. And I hadn't realized what an honor that was until we used to go to restaurants in Chamonix in the evening, because of course, with the camera crew, they weren't about to camp anywhere. All they wanted to discuss was where we were going to have supper in the evening. That was their entire topic of discussion. And so we would go down into different restaurants in the evening, and everybody would say, "How do you know Lionel? That's amazing, And so I was really elevated by having discovered this man as my friend. And what was so stunning about it, of course, is just these alpine fields full of wildflowers, the most extraordinarily beautiful wildflowers you've ever seen. And so I did this long study of just one little section of what you find in an alpine meadow at the right time of year. What am I doing here? Oh yeah, this is Denali. My great friend who died about 6 weeks ago, Professor Winslow Briggs, who was the director of the director of the Carnegie Institute of Plant Biology at Stanford, and a very, very much revered plant biologist. And when I asked him, what's the most beautiful place in the world you've seen, I thought he'd talk about something with plants in it. But no, he said Denali. And I thought, oh God, have I got to go to Alaska and paint Denali? He said, yeah, that's what I want you to paint. And I said, why, Winslow? And he said, well, when I was in Harvard, am I allowed to mention the word Harvard in here? Okay. When I was in Harvard Climbing Club in 1949, he said, we went to Denali and we did a route up to it's got two peaks, Denali, and the slightly lower one had never been climbed. So they did the first climb up the slightly lower peak, and on their way down, Winslow was roped to someone else who lost his footing and went sliding down an ice slope towards a precipice, and Winslow was knocked off his feet by the impact of this, and he too went sliding down. They were careering down this ice field at huge speed, and Winslow managed with his ice axe to turn over and do an ice axe arrest just as this chap fell over the edge, and he managed to haul him back up and saved both their lives. And he, ever since, whenever we hiked together over deserts, we hiked over deserts together, we went to the Grand Canyon together, Winslow would always insist on bringing his lucky ice axe. But anyhow, so Denali meant an enormous amount to Winslow, and so he insisted that I go and paint it. So there I am sitting, you can't see Denali, and that unfortunately was the case most of the time I was there. It's very pretty around, but you can't see the darn thing. And people travel for
hundreds of miles to see Denali, and it takes them hours and days to get there, and they never see it. They turn around and they go away again, and they might see a couple of grizzly bears and a wolf and a few birds, and they have to make their holiday out of that. And people have travelled all the way from, I don't know, the southern United States to go, and still don't find it. Anyway, I was very fortunate in the end because I'd already painted the foreground. This was another case where I'd painted everything except the mountain itself, just in the hope that I'd got the place right, got it exactly right. And so I painted all this. I painted the lake, or at least most of the lake. I couldn't put the reflections in, of course, because I couldn't see the mountain. I painted that range there, which I could see sometimes, but I had no sense as to where this really was. And finally, on the last 2 days, I managed to find it. And this here is a grizzly bear claw. And I thought there were 4 things that everybody knows about Alaska. There's oil, so that's a vial of oil. There's gold, so that's a vial of gold. There's grizzly bear claw, so that's that. Grizzly bears, and there's serapalin. So that's a little twig that I found that looks exactly like a rifle. And I thought, how wonderful! I can use that as a symbol for serapalin. But anyhow, when I'd finished this painting, the rangers who'd been kind of difficult when I was there, they're incredibly scrupulous about observing every single rule they can think of, and some that aren't even written down. And they'd been on my case terribly badly while I was working there. But finally, I met one who had been a ranger in the Grand Canyon, and I happened to show him a catalogue I'd got with me, which had Grand Canyon pictures in it, paintings. And he said, "Oh, you've been to the Grand Canyon?" I said, "Yeah, I've been lots of times." And he said, "Oh my God, wait, which route did you use to get this one?" And so on. And so we were talking about all that. And he said, "These are marvelous." He said, "Is there anything I can do to help?" And I said, "Well, you could ask your pals just to lay off." And he said, "Oh, are they giving you trouble?" And I said, "Well, yeah." I said, "All I'm doing is sitting there painting every day." I said, "I'm completely out of sight. Nobody sees me. I'm not damaging anything." I said, "And then I go and sleep in my tent at night, and I'm not causing any trouble whatsoever, but they're always on at me." And he said, "Okay, I'll call them off, but only on condition that you show me the picture when you finish." So I said, "Okay." So when I was leaving, I unrolled this picture on the floor of the ranger's cabin. All the rangers had assembled to see it. There must have been 12 of them. And they would go, "Oh, that's really nice," and so on. And they said, "Well, do you know where you were?" And I said, "Yeah, of course I know where I was." I said, "Here it is on the map. See that little cross on the map?" And I said, "That's where I was." And they said, "Yes, but do you know what it's called?" And I said, "Well, it doesn't say anything on the map. What is it called?" And they said, "It's called Ansel Adams Point." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because that's where Ansel Adams' famous photograph of Denali, the exact spot where he took his photograph. And you've been sitting in the exact spot." And he said, we don't have it on the map because everybody would go there and they'd ruin it. But that's exactly where you were. And sure enough, when I got home, I have an Ansel Adams book, of course, and I looked at it, and it was exactly the same place. I thought that was astonishing. In all the thousands of square miles of Denali, I'd happened to sit in the same spot. This too is from Alaska. This was a break where it was pouring with rain. My brother and I went south in the hope that we could find clearer weather, but we didn't. So I did this little tiny painting one night, cross as anything, because they'd all disappeared off to go and get to some cafe or something, and I was sitting there miserable as anything, bitten by black flies, and feeling really pissed off. And anyway, so I sat crossly doing this picture, and then when they all came back, they went, "Oh, that's really nice." And actually I thought, "Oh, it is quite nice, actually, yeah." Okay, now we're at the Grand Canyon, where I've been many times. This really was a homage. You call an homage, we call a homage, to another great friend, Professor Bill Brace, who was an earthquake specialist, director of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at MIT, and he'd taken me to the Grand Canyon in the first place to show, and we traveled in the Grand Canyon many times together, and it was wonderful to go with him because he explained the place brilliantly to me. And although he died a few years before I made this painting, I did it as a homage to him. And this is the biggest painting I've ever done. This is 7 feet by 4, and it took 23 days on site to do it. But I'm immensely proud of it because it was a nearly impossible task, I think. And there's the finished object. And along here are all sorts of symbolic objects that I found in the museum store. I went and sat in the museum store and they said, oh, help yourself to anything, just because I said I want to do a strip of studies of beautiful things that have been found in the canyon. So I did that strip. Many of the things, of course, are from Native America, the time that the Native Americans owned it and lived in it. Now it's owned by the National Park, of course. And so bits of pot and arrowheads and bits of jewelry and all sorts of nice things. One of those little animals made out of a stick. They think that that's 2,500 or 3,000 years old. That little thing is so dry there that things don't rot. And that's a little corn cob, and that is the exact size of a corn cob 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. They find them in their little tiny storehouses that they used to build. Where are we now? Oh, we're on the river. Yeah, this is actually the second trip I'd taken down the Colorado. The Center for British Art have now taken possession of the third trip, Heraclitus 3. This is Heraclitus 2. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher who said no one could ever step into the same stream twice. In other words, things are always moving. And this is the third raft journey I've done down the Colorado, and this one is the second. So there's some Colorado water, and I did a painting every day on a 7-day journey. Here we are in Borneo. Oh my God, we better get on. Sorry. Borneo, working on the rainforest, suggested by a great friend and explorer, Robin Hanby-Tennyson, and also by Professor Sir Gillian Prance, who was the director of Kew Gardens. They both suggested Borneo, so I could go and do that and once again kill two birds with one stone. So that Gillian Prance suggested Borneo because he said it's still got the best buttress trees, and so that's what interested him. And Henry Tennyson suggested it because, well, he has many associations with it, but I'm sitting in a cave, an enormous cave, which has got 3 million wrinkled-lipped bats living in it. And those 3 million bats go out at dusk, and they form these beautiful sinuous movements as they travel out to find insects. And scientists have discovered that they eat 20 tons of insects a night. Now, can you picture 20 tons of insects? I mean, what is that? Would it be this thing full, this lecture theatre full of insects? It's impossible to imagine, isn't it? But anyway, it does mean that you don't get bitten quite as much around here as you do in many other rainforest places. So I'm sitting in this cave, looking at the view outside, and here it is. That's what you could see was this wonderful rock here, this gigantic rock covered in vegetation, and it's just like something turned out of a jelly mold. Just the most beautiful shape. I'm sorry, I better hurry up. Here I am talking to Nyapun and his family. Nyapun is an old headhunter who was a friend of Robin Hanby-Tennyson's, and Robin asked me to go and find him to see if he was still alive, and to give him a small sum of money in case he needs it for hospital treatment or something, because he's an old man now. Nobody knows how old, he doesn't know how old, but I found him in the forest, and I had a very merry afternoon with him, going through some reminiscing and going through some stories, which I'll tell later if anybody's interested, but I will carry on now in case. But anyway, that's Nyapun, and a marvelous man, and we had a lovely time together. A Panan Indian. This is near my home. This is on Dartmoor, a place called Wistman's Wood, which is meant to be haunted. It's meant to be pixie-led, they call it in Cornwall. In other words, you can get lost in it because the pixies will divert you. It's supposed to be full of elves and witches and hobgoblins, and it does have that sense about it. It feels haunted. It's the most beautiful place, and a place of
that lots of people go to, and people always have apparently since Neolithic times. They've always congregated or gone to this sacred place. That's a study that I can't remember why I did that. Anyhow, I thought that if I was asking all these luminaries to nominate something, I ought to at least be able to nominate something myself. And so I nominated things that I could walk to out of my own back door. And I can walk to this. This is 150 yards from, no, not 500 yards from our house. So this is a little bit of swamp called Tywardreath Marsh. And it's tiny, but it's very, very dense. And I've always loved it. I walk through it very, very often, twice a week probably. And I've painted it many times. And so I did that painting of Tywardreath Marsh as my contribution. And this is another walk to from my own back door. This is a bluebell wood with granite rocks, a place called Luxillian Valley, which used to be heavily industrialized. It used to be mined for tin, copper, granite, and china clay. And so the samples along the bottom there are samples of the rocks that people were looking for and the things people were looking for in the Luxillian Valley. And the last one there is a tin ingot made by someone who gave it to me, and he is streaming still in the Luxillian Valley, but in a very small way, so it makes no impact. But what I loved about it was the fact that nature has taken back this, what used to be a heavily industrialized area. And this is the last slide, I think. This is the fall color in New England, and there was an enlargement of that at the beginning. And this was a friend of ours, Peggy Brace, married to Bill Brace, widow of Bill Brace, I should say. And I've traveled with Peggy many times too. And this is on the Concord River. And if you remember, my journey in America started in the Concord River in 1984, 85. So it felt like it had come full circle, as this was the last painting I did for this particular series. I hope that doesn't mean that I'm going to drop down dead any minute. But anyway, so that's the last painting of the series. And I think that's it. Can we have some lights? Thank you. If anybody has any questions, then do feel free to ask them. I'm not necessarily sure that I'll be able to answer them, but anyway.
Can you tell very quickly the Borneo headhunting story?
If people have got 5 minutes, have you got 5 minutes? Yes? No? Yes? Don't care either way? Robin Hanbury-Tennyson went out to Borneo to set up a scientific research station to try and preserve the rainforest. The rainforest in Borneo is heavily under pressure. There's not much of it left. It's mostly down to palm oil plantations. And as you fly over them, it is the most depressing experience. But there, where Robin set up his research station, because so many scientists, he had something like 200 scientists had gone to this research station, which he'd built over a period of 2 or 3 years. And they had measured, mapped, and studied absolutely everything. And so it is the most studied piece of rainforest in the world. And because of that, the Borneo government had no real choice but to turn it into a World Heritage Site and preserve it, which they do. It is preserved. And so that's one good thing from having an explorer go to pay attention. But anyway, Robin had made an extraordinary friendship with this man, Nyapun. And he was a nomadic headhunter with his family. They would build a little shelter in the forest, stay in it for a couple of days, 3 days. He would hunt with his blowpipe, and they would eat a monkey or they'd eat whatever Nyapun found, and then they would move on. So they were hunter-gatherers really. They just lived like that and lived very happily. And so Robin said, look, Nyapun's an old man now if he's still alive, so can you go and find him? And if he's still alive, give him £100, change it into local currency, and give it to him, because he might need it for medical treatment or something. So
I went and asked around, and after a while somebody said, yeah, Nyapun's still alive, I know where he is. And so I found a local chap who spoke Penan. He spoke actually 16 tribal languages, but he spoke Penan. And so we went off down the upriver, and there was, Nyapun had actually moved into a little hut on stilts. He's sort of his permanent residence, and he was a really old man. And he knew I was coming, and so his entire family were assembled, and we walked up. They had a sort of notched log that you walked up to get to into his little house, and there was this tiny little man sitting with his two wives, one tiny little wife either side of him, and anyway, it was very hard for him to get up, so he didn't get up. But anyway, Robin had given me 2 photographic books that he'd had published. One was of tribal people, because Robin started an organization called Survival International, which fights the case of tribal people to try and protect them against incursions into their property and so on. Usually by legal means, tries to protect them. And so he'd taken photographs of tribal people from all over the world who he'd worked with. That was one book, a black and white book. And then he had another beautiful book of gifts that he'd been given by tribal people. And so we went through the black and white book, and there were wonderful photographs of Nyapun as a young man with his blowpipe and his bow and arrow, and his little daughter who stood about this high with that kind of haircut like this, and little tiny thing, and this 40-year-old woman sitting there said, "That's me." And sure enough, you looked at it and you realized it absolutely was her. And so everybody loved that. And then we went on to the book about the gifts, and we went through the book of, and there was a blowpipe and some darts and a thing you keep your darts in, and there were some beaded things and some necklaces and bracelets and all sorts of things and Nyapun said, "Oh yeah, I gave Robin that, and I gave Robin that, and I gave him that, and I gave him that." And anyway, on one page there was a photograph of Nyapun's loincloth, which was made out of chewed bark. His wives had chewed this tree bark to make it soft, and then he wore it as a loincloth. And for some reason, he'd given that to Robin. And I said to Nyapun, "Well, Nyapun, you might like to know you're a really famous man in England, because your loincloth is in a glass case in a museum." And the idea that his underpants were in a glass case in a museum, it had his whole family were rocking with laughter. They were rolling around the floor, and it was just absolutely wonderful. And anyway, at the end of the afternoon, Nyapun creaked to his feet, and he rubbed his face on my face, and he took this necklace from round his neck, and he put it around my neck, and he said, "Now we are brothers." And so once I'd become Nyapun's brother, when I was in the forest working, the local people would come up and they'd grab me by the hand and they'd say, "Tony, come and see this." And they'd take me and show me something which I would never, ever would have seen otherwise. Fantastic, huge insects and birds' nests and a snake coiled up under a tree, all sorts of wonderful things that I just would never have noticed. And so that I thought was a huge honor, really, to have been appointed Nyapun's brother. Yes, sir?
Chile and Alaska?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Did you go to Chile and Alaska? Chile and Alaska?
Alaska, yes. Denali in Alaska, yes. Sorry, is that what you're saying? Could you speak into the mic? Perhaps I can hear it then.
Okay. Denali is a famous mountain, right?
I'm sorry, I still don't get it.
He's asking if Denali is a famous mountain.
Same as?
Denali. He wants to know about Denali. Is it the famous mountain, is what he's asking.
Is it famous? Yes, it is famous. I think it's the highest mountain. It's certainly the highest mountain in the America. It's 22,000 feet, I think. So it's way above any mountain in the lower 49 states. Is it 49 have you got? 48, okay. However many you've got. And so it certainly is highest, and it's climbed quite regularly now, but anybody who's climbed it, they have to train for a very long time, and it's enormously difficult to get actually to the mountain. But you can go into the national park, which is huge, It's 90 miles. You go on a dirt road, 90 miles into a little tiny sort of wooden habitations, little sheds, really huts, and they'll feed you and look after you at quite considerable price, I've got to say. And then if you're lucky and you stay there a few days, you will get to see Denali. But in my experience, you don't see it very often. I was there, I think, about a month, and I don't suppose I saw it for more than 2 or 3 days, which makes it hard going, really, because Alaska is a very expensive place. But nonetheless, I've got to say the salmon is good, the hospitality is good, people are friendly, but it is expensive, and the weather is pretty unpredictable. It can be pouring with rain for days on end, or it can be howling with wind, or it can be blistering hot. The nice thing is there's a lot of wildlife out there. As I say, grizzly bears and wolves and all sorts of things which are interesting. So it's a good place to go, but I wouldn't put it top of my tourist agenda, I've got to say.
Do you have a particular spot?
I'm sorry, but
Do you have a
my wife's always telling me I'm half deaf, so perhaps it's my fault. I
She
can't
says
really
the
hear.
same thing to me too. Do you have a particular spot from all the places that you've visited that you hold dear to your heart, that above all of them, this is the spot you'll
Yeah.
go to in your...
Well, I mean, apart from my home, of course, which I love dearly, I live in a marvelous village, which I love. Well, I think it's marvelous, and luckily my wife does too, called Tywardreath in Cornwall, and it's a small village, 1,500 people. They all know, everybody knows each other, and everybody knows each other's business, which is helpful most of the time. And when I'm away for weeks on end or months on end sometimes, I know that Anne is happy being at home, and people pay attention and make sure she's okay. And so that's my favourite place on Earth. But I guess my second favourite, that's difficult, because everywhere I've been, there's been something interesting about it. So I've always enjoyed everywhere I've been, some places more than others, I've got to say. Greenland, I've got to say, people say you should go to Greenland when you've been everywhere else first. And there's something in that, because Greenland's a pretty tough place. So I would put that fairly close to the bottom of the list, I guess. But I would happily go back any of the places I've been. But the one I've been to most is the Grand Canyon, because it's not so much from the rim, which is pretty heavily used, really. Although even there, there's a certain section of the rim which is used, but then if you get out in the backcountry, there are miles and miles of the rim which barely see anybody at all. I mean, I've camped, on the far west of the canyon in the Navajo land, and not seen a single person for 2 weeks. And so, there are remote spots even on the rim, but I much prefer to go down into the canyon, where you find there are exquisitely beautiful, intimate little views and things that you find where you really feel you're part of the landscape. And I've happily spent a couple of weeks in the canyon on my own and never seen a single human being. I mean, it drives you slightly insane, but when you come out, you realize you've had quite an experience, because it's such a strong, got such a strong presence somehow, the canyon. So I do love it. I've been there, I reckon I've spent 10 months of my life in the canyon or one or the other. So I've been there a lot. Yes, sir.
Do you recall what inspired you to take your first journey, and any lessons maybe you recall you learned early in that first journey?
Well, I guess the first serious journey, I mean, I had a very good friend. Makes it sound like all my friends are dying, and of course quite a few are, but I had a very good friend, a photographer, a very fine photographer called James Revilius, who's very well known in Britain. And he and I used to hike together sometimes. Usually, we started off just in Britain, just doing short hikes of a few days, and he would take photographs, I'd make paintings, and we never thought anything of it, really. We were just trying to develop our practice, I think. Never thought of exhibiting them, never thought to do anything with them, just thought this is a way of working that I'm going to try and develop. And then he and I followed Robert Louis Stevenson's Travels with a Donkey, in the Cevennes, the mountain ranges in France. And we spent 3.5 weeks following Robert Louis Stevenson's route. And it was then, I think, that I realized that, and we had a show in London together of that work. He did 20 photographs, I did 20, I think he did 22 photographs, I did 22 paintings. And it was then that I realized that actually this way of working was very satisfying, because it said a lot of things. I enjoy writing, obviously enjoy painting, but I enjoy observing, and I enjoy collecting things, and I enjoy being out, just having an adventure. And so I realized that this way of working incorporated everything I love to do. And I've loved to do it ever since, so I've been very fortunate, really. Was that an answer to your question?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Oh, well, maybe was there a lesson? I imagine at first,
A lesson.
first one, there was probably many things you experienced.
I'll tell you one lesson I did learn, which was that as I work on a theme, it may be that in getting to that theme, getting to that particular subject, you travel through all sorts of extraordinary places. But if you're going to be sidetracked, like right at the beginning, when I was doing the work about Henry Thoreau, we were driving up to Maine, and I saw lots of wonderful things. And I thought, God, that would make a nice painting. God, that would make a nice painting. I thought, no, if Henry Thoreau didn't go there, I'm not going there. And so I really had to concentrate on, if Thoreau went there, I'll go there. Well, that was something. But then, if I'm doing a series about volcanoes, if there isn't a volcano in the picture, then I don't do the picture. You see lots of good things, and you think, gosh, that would be a fantastic picture. But is there a volcano? No. Oh, okay, forget it. And so concentrate on the subject in hand. Otherwise, you'll be blown off course. And then your exhibition will just become a series of random landscape paintings with bits and pieces attached to them. It has to have a theme which makes some sort of conceptual sense.
Your themes certainly demonstrate that you're very dedicated and a person who can stay on track.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, when you sit down to do a work and you're confronted with this blank piece of paper, what is that process? Can you take us through the steps?
Sure.
Some of your works are very involved, some of them are done in a day. And what is that process like for you?
Okay. Well, of course, it's long and painful, but also it starts with me finding the site. I often walk around. I did a big painting of the Grand Canyon once, and it had taken me 13 days to find that site. And so I'd had my friends with me, and they'd come and gone, mostly gone, and pleased to do so, because we'd walk out, bushwhack our way out onto the end of a mesa, and no trail. We'd get to the end of it. I'd look at it, and because I wanted to do a big painting, I'd look at it and I'd say, "Sorry, this doesn't work." And they, "Well, what's wrong with it, for God's sake? There's the Grand Canyon. There's your piece of paper. Just get on with it, Foster." But I said, "Look, it just doesn't work. It hasn't got the sense of distance where I need it. It hasn't got a focal point. It hasn't got the foreground doesn't work. There's always a reason." And it took 13 days of doing that, going out into these wild places, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, driving everyone crazy. But finally, on the 14th day, I suppose, I walked right along the edge of the rim. I can't even remember what the place was called. And then I went, there, that's it. Now I've got it. So that's the first part of the process. You have to find exactly the right place. And don't out of desperation, that's another lesson. Don't, because your pals are saying, "For God's sake, Foster, haven't you found anything yet?" Don't be cowed by that. I learned early on, after having spent 6 days doing a painting, actually in the White Mountains. I went to paint Bristlecone pines. And I sat, because everybody was saying, "Come on, Foster, you must have found something around here." I thought, "Oh, okay, well, I guess that'll work." And I sat down and I worked on it for 6 days. And at the end of 6 days, I stepped back and I said, "This will never make a painting." And 6 days spent in these places, cold, hot, dry, wind howling. And you think, wow, that's terrible to have wasted 6 days. And so never plump for second best. That's the first part. And then having found the site, then I do a drawing. I draw the whole thing. Usually the drawings actually, I say it myself, but it's not just me says it. Everybody says, why don't you just leave it as a drawing? That's really beautiful. And sometimes they are. They really snap. They're just perfect. But anyway, no, I'm committed to paint them. So I then paint the sky generally. If I've got a sky, if I see a nice sky, I'll paint it. But I don't invent skies. If I don't see the right sky, I wait until I do see it. But it's best to get the sky first if you can, because from that, all the other colours stem. And if you paint all the rest first, and then paint the sky, you'll find that all the other colours are out of balance, and you have to go over them again and do all sorts of manipulating to get it right. So the sky first if you can, and then if it's a thing that's got a distant view, like the canyon or a mountain landscape, then I paint the stuff in the distance first, and then coming towards me until the foreground is last. If, on the other hand, it's the rainforest, where you've got leaves in front of you like this, and you can't see anything in the distance, then I paint the foreground and then paint everything behind it, which is, it's not at all classical watercolor technique. I mean, I always wish that I was Winslow Homer, that I could have that wonderful wristy technique where you can flood the paper with wonderful sizzling color, and suddenly it turns into, a stormy sea with a sky above it and a boat there and a man catching a fish, and done seemingly in 15 brush strokes. But I'm not. I'm internally damned to sit there hour after hour, day after day, working my way through this, kind of groping towards a solution. And I hate it, really. I just wish I could paint like anybody else. But I was speaking to an art dealer about it once, who dealt with my stuff, and I said, look, I took this 6-foot piece of paper thinking that I would end up painting like Winslow Homer, because what alternative would I have? But at the end of 2 weeks, I stood back and I thought, it's not at all like Winslow Homer, it's much just more damn Foster. And it's that kind of attention to getting the thing absolutely right, which is a sort of a killer. But on the other hand, I guess that's, luckily for me, people like it. So I guess it does have its advantages. But it is, I would love it to be able to do that lovely wristy technique.
Maybe one more question, so you all can talk to Tony more.
Hi, reflecting on your own childhood, how might you encourage a child today to be as intrepid and curious and adventurous as you've been?
Well, I don't know about adventurous, because most children now are taught not to be adventurous. That's a great question. But I must say that it's no trouble getting kids to enjoy and understand my work. They understand it immediately. Because kids, of course, naturally pick stuff up. They're naturally curious. That's what's so lovely about kids, is that that when you see them when they're young, they're so full of curiosity. It's just wonderful to see. And they pick things up and they take them home, and they make collections of, I don't know what, bus tickets or shells or butterflies, or they make collections of things naturally. They love it. They bring things home from the beach, and they bring things home from a walk, and they collect stuff together, and that means something to them. And so they understand my paintings because they've got these things attached to them. All these things mean something, and so they resonate with them, and so kids get that. And then they get the idea of maps. They learn about maps at school, at least they used to before Google. They used to learn about maps at school. They used to go on adventure studies and go out and learn about the great outdoors. They don't so much now because it's all on the screen. And okay, that's the great outdoors there, 5 inches by 4. But I don't have any. If kids are confronted with my work, I don't have any trouble getting them excited. I've got lots of junior Fosters in Cornwall who have seen my work in museums and in the local museum, because I always try and exhibit in London and then in Cornwall before the work comes to the States. And so the kids in Cornwall, many of them have been taught the Foster method by their teachers, because the teachers, there are so many kind of associations with the things that the teachers want to teach. There's about measuring, there's about time, there's about writing, there's about maps, there's about looking at things, there's about nature study, there's about all these different things, science, all sorts of things can come from my paintings. So teachers love it, really, and so there are all sorts of little Fosters walking about not my own children, but I haven't got any, but kids who've picked up on what I do. And in fact, in the museum, they had a wonderful little kind of thing where the kids had a pith helmet. They were all given a pith helmet, given a pith helmet and a little colouring, a sketchbook and a notebook, a pair of binoculars, and they went round my exhibition, and then they went off into the local park with their pith helmets and their little rucksacks, and it was just wonderful. And as it happens, I was there. There was a film playing in the background of me talking about something or other, and I happened to go to the museum for some reason, and I was doing something or other, and the kids had been watching the film, and then it came out, "It's him!" And then I had to sign all their sketchbooks, and anyway, it was delightful. So I don't think it's difficult to get them enthusiastic, really. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, there is one other thing. This wouldn't be America without a commercial break. And so the bookshop here has got a range of publications about my work. It's got a fabulous kind of coffee table book published by the University of Washington Press, which is very beautiful and tells the whole story of the last 35 years, really. There's this catalogue, which is the catalogue really for the show I've just shown you. There is another catalogue, Sacred Places. There are all sorts of bits and pieces. There are even free, if you don't want to buy a book, there's even a free bookmark you can get, which are very pretty little things. So if you want to, go down to the bookshop and see. Some of them are signed. If you're quick, you might get a signed one. Or if you see me later, I'll sign it for you. Anyhow, I don't get anything out of this. I just think the Centre of British Art, the poor devils need a bit of help. So, you're welcome. Oh, one other thing. If anybody knows anybody anywhere near Idaho, I have an exhibition opening later this week, funnily enough, a small exhibition of 15 paintings of a place called Copper Basin, which is showing in Gail Severn's gallery, or Gail Severn's gallery in Ketchum, Idaho, Sun Valley, Idaho. And if you look it up online, all the details are there. And if you know anybody in Idaho who would like to see the work, then that's where it'll be. And it's a nice show. It's a very sparkly show of lovely little things, really, really nice. I hope. I haven't seen it framed yet, but I'm looking forward to it. It'll be nice. So that's my part of the commercial pitch. Thank you. You've been a good audience. Thank you.